Are you struggling to get your music to sound professional inside Logic? Well, I hate to break it to you, but it's not Logic's fault. But it also isn't necessarily your fault or your music's fault either. It could just be more the mixing process that you're taking. The reality is there's a lot of little steps that go into the mixing process, but it doesn't have to be complicated. And in today's video, I want to give you a simple 6-step process that just goes through 6 steps that all professional mixes have and how you can do them specifically inside Logic. Let's talk about that. Welcome back to the Band Guide. I'm your band guy, Colin, and today we're looking at the 6 steps to a pro mix inside Logic. Now, before we even get into it, I want to give you something. I put together a downloadable guide so that you don't have to keep coming back to this video anytime you're mixing. It's completely free from the link in the description below, and it just goes through these 6 steps that all professional mixes have in a quick, easy reference so you can follow along without having to come back to this. But let's go ahead and get into it, starting with step number 1, which is the static mix. Now, the static mix is the most important part of the mixing process, and the amazing thing is it's also the simplest part of the process. There is only 2 things that we're focusing on this step, our volume and our pan position. So our goal with our static mix is to make our mix sound as good as we possibly can without any plugins, without any effects. And if you get this right, your mix is going to sound great. A lot of people skip this step. They just kind of jump straight from recording into mixing by putting on EQ and compression and effects. And they don't really spend time focusing on the most powerful tool at their disposal, which is just the volume. A lot of people don't realize that volume is massively impactful to how we actually hear everything in our mix. And the relative volume of everything is everything. So if a source is quieter, it's going to sound duller. It's going to sound further away. It's not going to have as much low end. If it's louder, it's going to have more low end, more high end brightness. It's going to sound more upfront, closer to you. So if you want your drums to sound big and full and round and punchy, you need them to be at the right volume. If you want your vocal to sound upfront and present, it needs to be sitting at the right volume. And you have to get these things set at the right volume initially and then mix around them to clear everything up and get everything sitting well next to each other. But you start with just your volume and your pan position. So before you even do this, I recommend taking off any plugins that you've already set. If you put on like a Logic preset or something like that, take off anything that's not part of the sound. So if you have an amp on your guitar, leave that amp designer on your guitar. You don't want to take off that kind of stuff, but you want to take off anything that's not part of the sound. If you put in a reverb on it and it has to be part of that sound, then leave it on. But don't have reverbs all over your mix because they cloud your mix and they cloud your judgment. So we want as little intercession as we can possibly get. And then we want to bring our volume all the way down on every single track. And then we want to bring them up in order of importance. So if you have struggled with your vocals cutting through in a mix, that's probably because you've not started with your vocals early in the stage of setting your individual volumes. I never struggle with a vocal being able to be loud enough in a mix because I set my vocal volume and mix around it. So the way that I like to do it is I set my volume for the vocal, and then I mix my kick and my snare around it. Then I mix my drums around it. Then my low end, and then all my mid-range stuff, my guitars, my back end vocals, all that stuff. So that's the way I would encourage you to do it as well. Now, a couple tips with this. First, you need to keep headroom at the top of your mix. So there's a digital 0 point that if your mix goes past, it just gets cut off. So you need to make sure that you keep headroom from that digital 0 point to the loudest point of your mix. And we do this by monitoring the output of our mix. My favorite way to do this is just to put the level meter plugin on my stereo output or master track or 2-bus or mix bus, whatever you want to call it. I think in Logic it defaults to being called the stereo out. You want to just put your level meter as a last plugin and keep that up the whole time you're setting your static mix. This allows you to keep an eye on that level and make sure that it never goes past -6 to -3 in the loudest section of your song. So I'd also recommend starting in the loudest section of your song, looping that section. Typically it's kind of the last chorus or something like that. Looping the loudest section of your song. That way you're not mixing in a quieter section and then you go to a louder section and now you're way too loud and it's getting past that digital 0 point. So really important to check your level and keep headroom. Tip number 2 is take advantage of wide panning. A lot of people miss this early on, but you want to have some things far left and some things far right. If you want your mix to feel big and wide, you need that width. Now you can play with this. You can have sections in your song where everything's a little bit smaller, and then when it gets to the chorus, everything's big and wide. But don't be afraid to have some things far left and far right. And with that, keep in mind that you also want to have things balanced. You don't want your mix to lean off to one side too much. So if you put a guitar far left, what are you going to put in the other ear to make sure that it still feels balanced in your final mix? Now, in the guide that I linked to in the description below, the 6-step checklist to a pro mix, I have a helpful guide that gives you kind of a starting point for panning positions to get some far left and far right panning in your mix and not start throwing off your mix and making it sound unprofessional. You want to be intentional with your panning, and that guide can help you out. Okay, so that is everything for the static mix. Once you finish the static mix, it is time for step number 2, which is master track processing. Now, master track processing is sometimes called top-down mixing. Either way, the idea here is that we're just doing a little bit of processing on our entire song in one place. This is going to help jumpstart a mix and make it feel like a cohesive mix that's not just a bunch of random tracks, but one mix that all gels together. So you want to find your stereo output, your master track, your 2-bus, your mix bus, whatever you want to call it. In Logic, it defaults to calling it your stereo out. You want to find that track, and you just want to do a little bit of EQ and compression here. Now, with EQ, we have to be super subtle. If you start to do too big of moves, it's going to start to feel very unnatural and over-processed. So I recommend maybe 1 decibel up to 3 decibel in boosts or cuts if necessary, and focus really primarily on the low end and the high end of your mix. So your sub and your bass, and then the upper shelf area where you're adding the brightness and the sheen to your mix. And again, 1 to 2 decibels, maybe 3 decibels on the high end for these EQ moves. But you can bring it up more initially, find the point that sounds good, and then scale it back down to where it's a little bit more reasonable and not making it sound over-processed. And then when it comes to compression, again, we want to be very, very subtle here. So here, I generally recommend a 30 millisecond attack time so that the initial hits can come through, somewhere around 100 millisecond release time so that it's not just moving a lot and giving a pumping sensation. And then we want to do a ratio that's somewhere around 3:1. You can go higher if it's rock music, lower if it's something a little bit lighter. And then you just set your threshold to where you're getting somewhere around 2 to 3 decibels of gain reduction in a louder section of the song. You can go a little bit higher, push that a little bit if you want to. If it's a real rock song, you can go a little bit lower if it's a lighter song, but just a little bit. Just think of it as kissing the meter. So that meter just should be flickering a little bit in a louder section of the song. But these two plugins together are going to make your mix feel way more cohesive, way more gelled together, and it's going to get you closer to that final product before you've even done anything on any individual track. So this whole step could take you 3 minutes, and your mix is going to sound better and save you time in all the other mixing that you're going to do. If you need a little more brightness on all your tracks, which is very common in a home studio recording scenario, if you need a little bit more brightness on all your tracks, if you do one shelf on the master track that brightens it all up, you might do little to no brightening on individual tracks. So it's going to save you time and help you mix faster in the end. So master track processing, do not skip it. Top-down mixing, whatever you want to call it, don't skip it. It's a really, really powerful tool. Now, before we move on to step number 3, I just want to say this video is an overview video, and if you want to see me actually apply this stuff, then definitely come back next week. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, be sure to subscribe so that you see this. But next week, we're going to start going through this entire process together in real time. You'll get to see me walk through, make these decisions, exactly what I'm looking at, kind of watch over my shoulder as I mix. So definitely subscribe if you're not already so you don't miss that. And if you like this video and you think it would be helpful to other people, be sure to like the video so that other people will see it. Help the YouTube algorithm, all that good stuff. Smash the like button. You get it. Anyway, let's move on to step number 3, which is EQ on individual channels. EQ is the most powerful tool you have inside Logic. Volume may be the most powerful thing in the mix, but EQ is the most powerful actual tool that we have inside Logic. EQ is how we shape the actual sound of everything going on. So if you want more clarity in your mix between all your instruments, you want more definition of your guitar and your kick drum and your snare drum, that's EQ. If you want your vocal to sound more present, that's EQ. If you want the kick drum to have more low end, that's EQ. If you want that bass to feel really round, you want that guitar to feel less harsh, all those things, they're all done with EQ. So it's a really, really powerful tool. But a lot of people overcomplicate it. They make it seem really, really confusing. At the end of the day, all you can really do with EQ is boost or cut. That's all you should be thinking about. So I like to think of it as 2 moves and 3 goals. Our 2 moves are boost or cut, and our 3 goals are highlight the good. So anything that we want to come through a little bit more in the mix, we highlight, boost with it. To minimize the bad, so if anything is kind of sounding a little bit weird or there's a little bit of too much of any sound, a lot of times in amateur mixes or home recordings, there's a little bit of a boxiness, a woofiness in the mid-range that we can kind of minimize. That helps clean it up a lot, give you less of a muddy sound to your mix. So minimize the bad, that's our second step. And our third is make space for every source. So for example, there's only so much low end that you have in your mix. And if you have all sorts of just noise coming from all the microphones in your mix, you can high pass those microphones, and that makes a little bit extra space for just clarity and punch in the low end from your kick drum and your bass and your other sources that really actually have and need that low end. So think of EQ simply as boosting or cutting, highlighting the good, minimizing the bad, and making space for every source. And with EQ, I have two big tips for you. Tip number one, if you struggle to hear EQ, boost like crazy until you hear what's really going on, and then bring down the volume of that boost to either cut if you're trying to cut, or just down to a more reasonable level. And tip number two, along lines with that, most of my EQ moves probably end up being somewhere between 4 to 6 decibels if I want it to sound fairly natural. But you want to do as little as you can, but as much as you need. So 4 to 6 decibels is fine, but if you need 9 decibels, 10 decibels, 15 decibels, that's all fine as well. So do as little as you can, but as much as you need to get it to sound the way that you want it to. Now, again, in that guide, the 6-step checklist to a Pro Mix, there is a little EQ cheat sheet that just breaks down the different sections of the EQ so you know where to go to boost or cut if you're hearing something specific. So if you're hearing kind of a boominess, where on the EQ do you actually go for that? So if you struggle with EQ, again, this guide is really going to help you out. It's completely free. But let's go move on to step number 4, which is compression. Compression is one of the least understood, least used tools by most home studio artists, but one of the most used tools by any professional mix engineer. Every song you've ever heard on the radio has compression all over it. It's a very important part in the mixing process. Now, a lot of people make compression seem very confusing, but it's actually a very simple tool. You want to think of it like an automatic volume fader, and you can use this volume fader to smooth out big peaks in audio, or make a drum punchier, cut through a little bit more in the mix, or bring out the subtleties, the quieter words in a vocal. Think of it with those 3 goals in mind. But fundamentally, it's just an automatic volume fader, but instead of you having to ride that volume fader up and down constantly, it's doing it for you. So continuing with this idea of it being an automatic volume fader, imagine a fader like you'd have on a mixing console. You set a threshold. Anytime the sound gets louder than that threshold, it's going to get turned down. How quickly it gets turned down is determined by the attack time. So if you have it wait a second before it gets turned down, then that's going to allow the sound to punch through a little bit more, like a kick drum or a snare drum, punch through a little bit more and then get turned down. So it's actually making it punchier and seem like it's cutting through more. Or if you make it really, really quick, it's going to help smooth out those big peaks that you might have in your audio. So that's great on a vocal or something that's really dynamic like that. And then how quickly it lets itself back up, it turns itself back up, is the release time. So if you want it to just quickly pop back up, that's a short release time. If you want it to slowly let itself back up and kind of turn down the stuff in between, that's a slow release time. So you could have a hit that is slow where it lets the hit through the kick drum and then it slowly releases back up. So it's released back up right before the next hit. And that's going to make each hit feel punchier and kind of turn down the stuff in between, but let that initial hit through. Okay, so the next thing to understand is the ratio. That's just how intensely it's going to turn it down. So a light ratio is going to turn it down less. A higher ratio is going to turn it down more. And then you have your makeup gain, which is just to make up the gain that you might lose because it's inherently going to be turning it down. So that's a compressor. Don't make it too complicated. Think of it as an automatic volume fader. You're just setting a threshold, how quickly it's going to turn it down, attack time, how quickly it's going to let it back up, release time, how intensely it's going to turn it down, ratio, and then the makeup gain so you're not losing any volume. That's it. That's a compressor. So a very powerful tool that seems complicated, takes a little bit to get your head around, but as long as you understand conceptually what you're doing, even if you struggle to hear the minute differences, you can set a compressor just based on the concepts of it that I just laid out. So don't be afraid of compression. It's a very important part of the mixing process. Okay, step number 5 is effects. Effects are things like reverb and delay. And a lot of people start with this way, way too early. They have a vocal, the first thing they do is slap some reverb on it. You do not want to do that because reverb literally clouds up the mix. It takes the sound and dissipates it longer throughout the mix and makes it harder to tell what's going on and what is getting muddy and all those things. If you wait until step 5 to actually start introducing effects into your mix, or at least primary effects into your mix, then you're going to have a much cleaner mix and you'll be able to tell if things start to get muddy that it's the effects that are doing it, not anything else going on in the mix. So shape your entire mix, get it where it's feeling really, really good and nice and clear, and then build that space in around it and fill in those little gaps with effects. And if you hold off, it's going to help you out. Now with effects, there's 4 really most common types of effects. There's small room reverbs. This is something kind of like a realistic space. The second is like a medium to long reverb. This is typically a little lusher, often a little bit more obvious, kind of filling in space, filling in gaps in a mix, best in slower mixes in a lot of cases, or on slower sounds. Then we have a time delay. This would be something in time with the song that's like a delay. delay. You get it. And it's in time with the song. And then we have a slapback delay. This would be a really, really fast delay that you don't necessarily obviously notice, but it's kind of giving you the effect of sound slapping back off a wall. I typically break these out into two camps that are more about the size of the space that it makes you think of. A small room reverb and a slapback delay create kind of a smaller sense of space. And then a medium to long reverb or in a time delay give you a longer sense of space. And you can blend all four of these together in one mix sometimes, but often kind of finding the vibe that fits the mix, if it's going to be smaller, if it's going to be bigger, that can help it sound more cohesive. Now, two big tips when it comes to using effects. Tip number one, the best effects are felt, not heard. So a lot of times the way that I set my effects is I bring them up till I start to hear them, and then I scale them back just a little bit. As soon as I start to hear it, I actually want to turn it down and make it a little less obvious. Tip number two is to use buses. These are huge time savers and can help create a more cohesive sound. Buses seem confusing, but are actually very, very simple. I'll link to a video I did above here where I explain everything you really need to understand about buses in about 5 minutes, so definitely check that out. But buses are basically just where you can send over to one track where you have your effect. So if you create one vocal reverb sound that you really love, you could send all your vocal tracks over to that one reverb effect, as opposed to having to put a reverb plugin and dial it in for every single plugin that's using a lot of CPU power. It's taking longer. Bus effects are just huge time savers, and because you just have one or a few tracks that you're using throughout your mix, it helps create a more cohesive sound. So that's effects, that's step number 5, and finally, we get into step number 6, which is automation. Automation is crazy. It's kind of like having a million little minions running around inside Logic, just doing things for you, turning something up, painting something off a little bit more to the right, turning your reverb up, bringing your reverb back down. Whatever you want, you can have Logic do for you and really tweak your mix to be exactly what you want it to be. Back in the day, you used to have to do this all manually while you were printing a tape, or if you had more things than you could physically do, you'd have to have an assistant come in or an intern come in and turn a knob and bring things down. And if you get it wrong, you're just printed and you can't do anything about it. You have to start all over again. But if you get it wrong inside Logic, you just continue to tweak until it's right. So really powerful. Now, you can automate just about anything. You can automate individual plugins. You could automate an EQ band, one EQ band, get really specific. But while you can do everything, I'd recommend you really just start with 3 things. The first is your vocal volume. We call this vocal writing. And the idea here is after you set your compression, you just want to listen through your vocal in the context of your mix and listen if anything gets too loud or too quiet. If anything gets lost in the mix, just bring it up with a little bit of automation and turn it up just a little bit. If it gets too loud, you just turn it down a little bit. Another cool trick you can do here is turn up the end of phrases so that you get this real sense of closeness from the singer. So as they trail off a word, you just bring it up a little bit extra. That can really be a nice touch as well. Okay, second is our pan knob. So is there anything that we can adjust panning wise to give a little bit more width or a little less width at different points? So for example, I'll often bring my guitars in a little bit in the verses and then pop them all the way left and right in the choruses so that the choruses feel a little bit bigger and wider. So play with your pan automation. And then third is your effect automation. So very common that we make verses feel a little bit tighter, a little more intimate, a little bit smaller, and then choruses, everything balloons out and feels really huge. So I'll bring the effects down or all the way off in the verse, and then they'll come back big and strong in the choruses. Okay, so those are the 3 main areas that I would recommend automating. And the last note about automation is that the biggest mistake I see people make in mixing is that they automate their volumes way too early. You likely need to do less volume automation, and you don't know what volume automation you need to do until after you've done your compression. So hold off on automation until this very final step and just use it as a final point to tweak and perfect your mix to get as close to what you're hearing in your head as you possibly can. So that's the 6 steps: static mix, master track processing, EQ on individual channels, compression on individual channels, effects, and finally automation. Now, it's really important to know that mixing is not where we make our song loud. When you finish this mix, it's likely going to feel quiet, and that's to be expected. Mastering is where we actually bring the volume level up to a commercial volume. So don't worry when you finish this mix that it's quiet. Then it's time for mastering, and we'll talk about that coming up soon. But first, if this video was helpful, be sure to leave a comment and like this video to make sure that more people can see this. And if you know anyone else looking to get better at making music inside Logic, then be sure to share this with them. I'd love to hear from you. Are there any of these steps that you've been missing that you're excited to start implementing into your mixing process? Let me know in the comments below, and just let me know if this is helpful in general. I'd love to know that this video is helpful to people. And be sure to grab the 6-step checklist to a pro mix. It's really going to help you out. And finally, don't forget to subscribe, because next week we're going to be back and we're going to start going through this process together in real time, where you can see me actually going through and making these mixing decisions. If this video was helpful, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next week with another video.